This is episode 129 of the Death to Tyrants podcast. I want to tell you guys about a great sponsor of the Death to Tyrants podcast, and that is our friends over at Zippix Toothpicks. These are flavored toothpicks. They've got several great flavors. Check these out: cinnamon, clove, mocha, and whiskey even. But not only that, each toothpick actually contains nicotine, and I use these toothpicks all of the time. Not only are they a great alternative to that nasty habit you may be trying to stop, and that includes vaping, come on now, but they taste great. They are way more socially acceptable. They are cheaper than any alternative. Hell, I don't even dip or smoke or anything like that, and I still love these Zippix toothpicks. Out of all the alternatives on the market, these are the most cost-effective, and better yet, they are a sponsor of this show. When a small business is out there helping to support one of your favorite Liberty podcasts like this one, let's thank them by returning the support. Since you are a loyal listener to the Death to Tyrants podcast, you will get 10% off of your order by entering promo code DTTP at checkout when you order over at zippixtoothpicks.com. Once again, go to zippixtoothpicks.com. That's ZIPPIX toothpicks.com. And type in promo code DTTP for Death to Tyrants podcast at checkout, and you will get 10% off of your order, and you will be supporting Zippix and Death to Tyrants at the same time. So go do it. Let's get to the show.
The crushing weight of the tyrant's passage had left nothing unmarked.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again. This is going to be a crazy week, isn't it? This is the Death to Tyrants podcast, and as always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you now from Lockhart, Texas. And what a week this is going to be. Some of you guys listen to this on the day it drops. Some of you don't listen to it for a few days after. Whatever the case, this is election week. And if nothing else, it should be quite interesting. We shall see. Speaking of interesting, my guest today is Norman Singleton. And Norman, there's a few things Norman did, plenty of things Norman did in life I'm a little jealous of. One of them, he worked for Ron Paul from 1997 to 2012, which obviously puts him there through all of the Ron Paul revolution years. I know that turned a lot of you guys into libertarians. But not only that, not only story after story of working for such a great person, he spoke with Murray Rothbard a few times on the phone and got to see Murray deliver what is, in my opinion, maybe his best speech ever, and that is a strategy for the right at the John Randolph Club. How cool is that? So we're going to get into Murray Rothbard, what lessons we can learn from the version of populism that Murray preached, as well as Ron Paul's version of populism that he basically preached. It's very similar, obviously, and we're going to relate it to where we are today. And again, this is election week, so there's no telling where we are today when you're listening to this. Will it be settled? Are we drawing it out for a week or two or more? We shall see. But like I said, Norman Singleton worked for Congressman Ron Paul from 1997 to 2012. He served as legislative aide on education and workforce issues for Congressman Paul from 97 to 2001, when he became Ron Paul's legislative director. How cool is that? Also, he was one of the founding members of the Republican Liberty Caucus and still works to this day for Campaign for Liberty. You guys remember that organization? Well, please welcome to my show, Norman Singleton. Norm, how are you, sir?
I'm doing fine, Buck. How are you?
I'm doing great. I've got to say, this is not always the case with my guests, but I've actually had multiple people request that I get you on this show. So I'm glad to finally get you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's an honor to be here. Certainly in distinguished company with some of your prior guests like Lou Rockwell, Daniel McCarthy, and my old Hill comrade, Bishop.
Yes, yes.
I hate to out Tho for our hardcore libertarian followers, but he was once on the government payroll.
That's right. That's right. That's what I understand. And of course, I've had Dr. Ron Paul on the show as well, and we definitely will get to some discussion surrounding him. I have a few directions that I want to take this conversation. First, for my listeners who may be unfamiliar with you, Norman, talk about who you are, what you do, and your history in the political world.
Well, I'm currently president of Campaign for Liberty, which is, I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, is a grassroots mobilization and education organization that was founded in 2008 following Dr. Paul's 2008 presidential run. And Campaign for Liberty works to move the politicians in a pro-liberty direction, not by drowning them in white papers and policy reports, but by by mobilizing their pro-liberty constituents who understand the importance of things like sound money, a peaceful foreign policy, no welfare state directed by the federal government, and certainly no corporate welfare state, and getting them to contact their politicians and pressure them to vote for liberty and against statism. Our top issue, signature issue since the group was founded, has always been the audit the Fed bill. Campaign for Liberty's efforts, building on Dr. Paul's success in 2008 and making the Federal Reserve once again an issue that you could actually discuss in American politics, and you could actually be critical of the Federal Reserve, even in some of the mainstream media outlets, has got that bill through the House of Representatives twice by an overwhelming bipartisan majority, and it came within, I think, six votes of breaking a filibuster in 2016. Even though we were missing at least one senator who would have voted for it, and that was Senator Cruz, who was in New Hampshire that day. Whereas Senator Paul, who was the lead sponsor of the bill, Rand Paul, and Senator Rubio, who I know a lot of libertarians have disagreements with on a lot of issues, but he is good on the audit the Fed issue. I certainly have my differences with Senator Rubio on a wide variety of issues, but he's not always wrong. Managed to leave the campaign trail and come to D.C., find time to come to D.C. to participate in the debate and the vote on the audit the Fed bill that day. Our other issues have been opposition to the Patriot Act. We were very instrumental in mobilizing public support when Senator Paul filibustered the Patriot Act renewal in 2015. And he did manage actually to get some of those bad provisions shut down for about a week. And even though they were ultimately renewed, he did manage to move the debate with Campaign for Liberty's support from, should we just renew these provisions or should we have some fun and reform, to, do we want to reform them or do we want to repeal them? And we keep plugging away on that. We've opposed opposition to gun control is a major issue for us. And also trying to get the Republicans to fulfill their promise to actually fight to repeal Obamacare in 2017. This year, we're focusing a lot on, as most of the liberty movement is, ending the lockdowns and just ending the lockdowns. No saying that we'll let you out of your house if you agree to have this untested vaccine that was rushed to the marketplace for political purposes. And then also, by the way, you have to let us give you these Fauci Gates digital certificates so that we can, a medical version of your papers, please, so that we can make sure that you're properly immunized. And of course, the odds that that's going to end up, as Dr. Paul has talked about, that's going to end up just being for COVID is ridiculous. It's going to end up being anything that the government decides that you need to show you're healthy. And it could even spill over into things like make sure that your weight is within a proper range, that you can tell that you're exercising, dieting, even brushing your teeth. And the justification of that would be, as we see with COVID, the overweight are more likely to get to succumb to viral infections and have fatalities. and also, of course, diseases like or conditions like diabetes. But that doesn't justify government control of our personal lifestyle choices. But I think that you can see that that's the direction that we might be headed for.
Right. Yeah, no doubt. Let me ask you, which politicians so far in your experience working through this lockdown mess, which ones are friendliest to, let's say, our point of view being anti-lockdown?
I think in Congress, once again, the two from Kentucky, Senator Rand Paul, who has been very good in his position on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee in challenging the call of Fauci and the call of mask and the call of lockdowns that have arisen, and the idea that Dr. Fauci is to be treated as infallible because when he speaks, it's science, and when other people speak, even other doctors and scientists speak in contradiction of him, they're just spreading conspiracy theories. I mean, even herd immunity, which is a long-standing recognized medical concept as to how a population overcomes pandemics, has been derided as a conspiracy theory because it doesn't fit the narrative as dictated by the media's beloved Dr. Fauci. Has been good. Dr. Thomas Massey has also been good speaking out about this. At the local level, the governor of Florida has been very good in resisting the calls to keep his state under lockdown. And Kristi Noem of South Dakota, former representative, has also been very good at standing up for the rights of her people, the citizens of the state, to make their own decisions as to how to best protect themselves and their families from COVID, instead of having the government come in and say, you shall wear a mask.
Right. I know you worked for Ron Paul for a number of years. I want to ask you, how did that start? How does one become so lucky to work for Ron Paul for so long? And what years did you work for him?
Well, it's funny you say, how does one become so lucky? Because when I first became aware of Dr. Paul was in the mid-'80s or late '80s when he was running for the Libertarian Party nomination, and I was a young libertarian studying Austrian economics, and I came across him, and I guess it probably would have been Reason magazine that I was a regular reader of, still am, and found out that there was this former congressman who voted the right way and actually, like me, shared an interest and passion for liberty and Austrian economics. And at the time, I remember telling somebody, it's too bad Ron Paul isn't in Congress anymore because he's someone that I would love to work for on Capitol Hill for. But I became active out of my interest in various libertarian-related activities, including co-founding a Federalist Society chapter when I was in law school with another libertarian who had studied under Hans Sennholz at Grove City before going to law school, and that was Scott Bullock, who some of you may recognize as the current president of the Institute for Justice. And I also was an original member of the Republican Liberty Caucus, as well as being a member of the Libertarian Party. It's my interest in trying to advance libertarianism, both inside and outside the major party system. And I also became friendly with because of a letter I wrote to him, and then we just started talking and corresponding, and he hired me to do some research for him in the early 90s with Lou Rockwell, who everybody knows was Ron's chief of staff before he went to found the Mises Institute. And so in the mid-90s, I was actually in D.C. working for the National Right to Work Committee, and I heard that Ron was interested in returning to Congress. I called Lou, and I talked to another friend of mine who was working for the campaign, who had worked in the 88 LP campaign, and they arranged for me to come down and do some volunteer work for Dr. Paul congressional campaign. The first thing I ever did for him was opposition research. I organized his opposition research on Greg Laughlin, the Democrat who turned Republican, who was running against Ron in the Republican primary, where Ron had to run against the open opposition of the Republican establishment, including Newt Gingrich, who came to the district to campaign against Ron, and the then governor of Texas, a fellow named George W. Bush. And Bush's political henchman, Karl Rove. I heard from a number of sources that Rove was very involved in the efforts to quash Ron in that primary. Of course, luckily, Ron won the primary, went on to win the general election, and hired me as his legislative aide. Ron was assigned the Education and Workforce Committee, which was actually his third choice. His first choice, of course, was banking, so he could continue his work speaking out against the Federal Reserve and challenge the cult of Greenspan, which some of your listeners recall was a huge thing in the 90s. The idea that we had this maestro in charge of our monetary policy, and we would never have to worry about the business cycle again. That came to an end with the NASDAQ crash. But for the first few years, I was a lonely voice in challenging that cult of Greenspan. In fact, his only ally was Bernie Sanders on the left, and occasionally Barney Frank, also from the left. But almost all Republicans except Ron and the vast majority of Democrats just treated Greenspan as this great oracle, which they tend to do for all Fed chairmen, which is why it's important that there was always Ron up there, at least put a different voice in to say that no, because look at what Mises and Senholz and Rothbard and Hayek and Hazlitt all taught us about what you're doing. You're destroying the economy. You think that everything's great because we're in the bubble phase, but there's going to be a bust, and it's going to be your fault. And it's not going to be because what everybody else is going to tell you, especially the left, that you took the punch bowl away too soon. It's because you set the punch bowl out in the first place. You don't blame the host of the party for everybody's hangover because they took away the grain alcohol punch too soon. You blame them because it's about the grain alcohol punch in the first place and got everybody loaded, to use a metaphor. Anyway, sorry, I got ahead of myself. I tend to start talking about the Fed. I tend to
no worries.
Get passionate and get ramble a little bit. But anyway, Ron wanted to be on the International Affairs Committee so he could also speak about foreign policy. And because Ron opposed foreign aid, that was nixed. So he was put on education and labor, and I got to do that work for him because he was because of my background at Right to Work. And we spent 3 years on that committee trying to remind Republicans that we're supposed to oppose, not expand the Department of Education. In 2001, Ron got on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and what I had heard was that one major reason was because up until September 10th, 2001, George Bush's priority and what he thought would define his presidency was No Child Left Behind, which was going to expand federal power over education, but do it in a, quote, conservative, unquote, way through national tests and standards and all of that. And that they didn't want a Republican from the president's home state, nonetheless, on that committee, who they knew going in was going to be a fierce critic of the law. So they decided to give Ron the International Affairs chair committee slot where they thought that he couldn't make trouble, where they thought he wouldn't make trouble for the administration. And of course, that ended up with having a fierce critic of the president's foreign policy from the president's home state, nonetheless, on the International Relations Committee during the build-up to the Iraq War. So be careful what you wish for, because sometimes you might get it.
Yes, no doubt. And I'm sure that the president at the time was not happy that Dr. Paul was in that particular position. When Ron decided to run for, I guess, president, so to speak, but at least the Republican nominee, did that surprise you? Did that come out of left field, no pun intended, or had that been something that y'all discussed at some point?
Ken Snyder, who was the head of a group called the Liberty Committee, which was kind of Campaign for Liberty 1.0 in the 90s and the 2000s, had been pushing Ron to run as a Republican for president since at least 2004. He thought he wanted Ron to primary Bush, and Ron turned it down. And then for a variety of reasons, a big reason was that, remember going in that the 2006 election, the Republicans' Congress was decimated for a variety of reasons, but the one reason was the war weariness. And the war weariness kind of played into the general theme of Republicans have lost their way. They lost their way on war, and that led them to lose their way on spending, and just lose their way. And they just look like a bunch of corrupt, incompetent boobs who cared nothing, who cared for nothing except for holding on to power. And they were willing to betray every principle that they supposedly believed in order to do that. And so Ron thought that, talked with Ken about it, and who was pushing him to run, and Ron came to the conclusion that this would be a good year to run because there might be people and they're receptive to his, particularly his anti-war message. And he one day just called all the staff into his office and said that he was thinking of with Kent and Joe, who had previously been on staff and now Joe is an attorney, and Joe was going to be counsel to the campaign if there was such a campaign, and said he was thinking of running for president. We all talked about it. It was there was myself, Tom Lizardo, who was then chief of staff, Jeff Deist, who your listeners will recognize that name, I know, who was then press secretary, Daniel McAdams, one who I'm sure your listeners' name will also recognize, yes. And Adam Dick, who I know a lot of your listeners' name will also recognize. And we discussed it, and my feeling was that it would be nice to have Ron in the debates and on the campaign trail, because otherwise the only person representing the anti-war cause would be Dennis Kucinich. And I love Dennis Kucinich, but I really thought it would be important at that time to have someone who's not a man of the left representing the cause of peace, someone who ties the cause of peace to the cause of economic liberty, to this, and who also could speak about the root cause, which is the Federal Reserve. So I wasn't surprised when he announced, because I was kind of surprised when he said he was seriously thinking about it, but it sort of made sense when I heard his reasonings. And like I said, I was supportive of the idea. I think I said something like, well, you should at least form an exploratory committee, go to the early primary and caucus states, and try and get in some of the early debates and see what happens. Worst comes to worst, you still have your congressional seat from which to use as a platform to get the message out as best as we can. What surprised me was, particularly after the famous Giuliani moment, when I had, to be honest with you, I had two thoughts. Number one was, go Ron, go. This is wonderful. This is Ron being Ron at his best. And the second thought was, am I going to have to write a resume tomorrow and start sending it out to people? Because am I about to lose my job? And of course, not only was I not, but something absolutely that I don't think any of us predicted, even the most optimistic people around Ron, and Ron himself predicted what happened, which was all of a sudden this grassroots movement exploded. And I knew that things were changing when other staffers would come up to me and say, do you know how popular your boss is in my district, in my boss's district?
Wow. And
a lot of them were very complimentary about it, because a lot of them were kind of secretly admired Ron, because they knew that Ron was someone who, never thought, I'd better vote the way that Gingrich or Boehner want me to, because otherwise I'm not going to get that chairmanship that I want.
Right.
They knew that Ron was a man of principle who operated solely from principle, and they admired and respected that. And also the fact that Ron was always a nice guy. And I tried to, and those of us on the staff tried to always do that too. We tried to, make friends with other staffers on both sides of the aisle, because we know we would be disagreeing with them on ideas and principles. So let's not bring personalities into it. Let's try to keep it on the higher level. And I parenthetically wish there was more of that in politics today. That focus on disagreeing with people on principles. Don't get into personality divides. But I just noticed this change happening, and then there was these stories of and pictures of people in Ron Paul Revolution signs springing up all across the country, and supposedly Jesse Benton told me that they got a call from the media. I forget which outlet it was. They wanted to do a story on Ron, and they said they wanted to do it because the person in charge said was on a cross-country drive this weekend, and if you drive around the country, you will think that the only person running for president is this guy named Ron Paul, because he's the only one person you'll see with signs up, and they're not his signs; they're signs that his supporters are making.
That's right.
We need to, so there's a story here. What is it about this guy and that kind of surprised me. The fact that there was this reaction there. And that year, that was one of two things that surprised me, to be honest. And they both were kind of rooted, I think, in the people's desire for change, because the other surprise was that Barack Obama beat Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary. When he announced, Kent and I were talking about the way the race was shaping up, and I said, I don't know who this guy, Barack Obama, thinks he is. He's not even a first-term senator. He hasn't even completed his first term yet, and he actually thinks he's going to beat Hillary Clinton, who's been running for president since her husband won his first term in 1992. And the Clintons own the Democratic Party. There's no way. But I underestimated the desire for change. And of course, we all know what happened, and we all know Obama was a disappointment not to me, because I didn't really expect any great shakes from him, but to those who thought that he would actually bring fundamental change to the system in terms of foreign policy and civil liberties. He was a slightly to the left version of George Bush.
Yes. Yeah.
On the other hand, the Obama years did bring a flourishing of the liberty movement.
Yes.
In part because of the reaction against his Obamacare, and then also because the reaction against the fact that on war and civil liberties, issues where the left is supposedly good on, he was horrible. In fact, I hate to disagree with my friend Scott Horton, but actually I'm not even disagreeing with Scott. I'm just kind of tweaking it a little bit. Scott likes to say that libertarians are better than the left on what the left is good on, and we're better than the right on what the right is good on. Meaning we're better than conservatives on free market economics and issues like gun control. We're better than the left on war and civil liberties. Civil liberties is actually the libertarians. We're not just better than the right and the left on the liberty issues that each side is supposedly good on. Is that we actually mean it.
Yes.
It's not just rhetoric to fool the grassroots. We really are anti-war. We really are anti-spending. We really are anti-welfare, anti-tax, pro-gun, and pro-peace.
Yes. That actually brings me to a question. It just kind of popped in my head as you were talking about that, because you were with Dr. Paul in 2008, and we all know that's when Obama won his first term, and you were with Dr. Paul's campaign in 2012, I believe, which is obviously when Obama won his second term. Between those 4 years, did you see just a giant change in the anti-war left? Did it seem like there were more and they were friendlier to Ron Paul's message in 2008, in the run up to 2008, I should say, than it was 4 years later? Did they disappear? What was your experience with that?
That's a good question. I think that there are two types of leftists, just like there are two types of rightists. Jonah Goldberg, I think wrote a very interesting article in the Bush years, attempting to explain to libertarians and principled small government conservatives, constitutional conservatives, why we were so frustrated with some of our supposed allies, which is there's basically two types of conservatives. There's conservatives who oppose big government on principle and conservatives who oppose the left. And so they oppose big government when it's run by the left. And so they're not being inconsistent when they support a big government that's controlled by the right, because they're not opposed to big government, they're opposed to the left running things. I think you can say that about the anti-war movement. There is a small group of progressives who are sincerely anti-war, and they don't care if it's Barack Obama or George Bush or Donald Trump or Joe Biden, maybe. More likely Kamala Harris, who is going to be controlling the war party. They oppose the war. But there is another group that opposes Republican wars. And they oppose Republican wars not because they oppose war, but either because they're partisan hacks or because they think that when Republicans start wars, they're wars in places like Iraq that have oil because they're doing it because they want to serve their greedy oil paymasters. But when Democrats start wars, they're started in places like Bosnia or Syria, and they're done because bad dictators are gassing people, and they need to send women are being oppressed, and we need to send the military in to preserve human rights and to bring them democracy. And therefore, the left's wars are good wars, humanitarian wars. They actually have that phrase, humanitarian interventionism. And so I think what you saw was some of the left, after Obama came in, they still were attracted to Dr. Paul, at least Dr. Paul's attacks on the military-industrial complex and foreign policy. Just like even during the Bush years, there always was that remnant, to coin a phrase,
yes,
of conservatives who would vote with Ron against the administration, against the Bush administration on the Bush administration's big spending programs. And what's really been disappointing, though, is that to see the extent of Trump derangement syndrome is that whenever Trump says something good, instead of the majority of anti-war progressives saying, okay, we're going to work with him on this.
Mm-hmm.
We hate the guy, but we can work with him on this. They will bend themselves into knots to say, no, we can't support him because of Orange Man bad.
Right.
Very early in the administration, in the Trump administration, I was told by a friend of mine who works for another fiscal conservative organization that they were talking to one of our progressive group that had been an ally in the effort to cut military spending, who said that after Trump came out early in his tenure against the F-35, the big Lockheed Martin boondoggle that's wasted billions of dollars, they said, well, we're not going to engage in support of the administration's positions on supporting the F-35. And this had always been a key issue for this organization.
Wow.
But they said, because we're opposing everything that the administration does, and we're not supporting anything the administration does.
Wow.
And this was in like February of 2017. So it's like you've already decided that you're not going to do, even if it's something that you've worked on for years. I mean, imagine if, say, Joe Biden is elected next week, and in his inaugural speech, he said, and I believe that it's time to audit and end the Fed. And I came back on your podcast and I said, well, Buck, Campaign for Liberty, we're dropping audit the Fed. And we're certainly not going to take up end the Fed because Joe Biden now supports it. And we, as an organization, as a matter of principle, we oppose everything that Joe Biden does, even if it's something that we have advocated for years. I mean, what do you think the vast majority of libertarians would think?
Yeah.
What do you think Ron Paul would think of me?
Right.
If I did that.
Right.
But this is the type of thinking you get in Washington. And so I fear I've veered from your original question, but the answer to your original question, I mean, we saw with the same frustration that everybody else did, that the anti-war left really shrank to a handful, and that handful was pretty much unable to influence policy. There's a very good article explaining why militarism and hyper-interventionist foreign policy actually fits the progressive agenda perfectly.
Yes. What is that? I'd be curious to see that article. Can you think of it off the top of your head? Because that's a philosophy I completely think is accurate.
It's on this from the Spectator. It's called "Why Biden Fits the War Party."
So obviously, you were a part of the campaign, and I'm sure the way Ron was treated wasn't completely eye-opening. And I say treated, I mean by the elite, by the media, by the corporate press and whatnot. We all kind of witnessed that red-pilled a lot of people, I believe. Having watched how Donald Trump has been treated by the media and kind of the same institutions, did that give you any insight as to, wow, imagine how a president, Ron Paul, would have been treated?
I mean, we kind of already knew if Ron were to win, what would happen? I mean, he beat, just his agenda was basically against every entrenched interest in D.C. And against what is the heart of our current system, which is the Federal Reserve. So, I always assumed several things. One, which was that the elite would pull out all the stops to prevent him from getting the nomination. And if he got the nomination, they would pull out all the stops to ensure that he lost. I mean, but seeing Trump just kind of reaffirmed that, because you see, I don't think in my lifetime, I mean, I've seen, blatant media bias in a lot of campaigns, but I don't think I've ever seen it so, trying to think of the word for it.
Blatant?
I mean, open.
Yes.
Yeah. Blatant. On the other hand, because of the partisanship angle, and because Trump is very popular with Republican voters, you see a lot of Republicans who you never would have thought would have been embracing some of these positions, questioning war. And unfortunately, some of them are now questioning free market economics and in international trade and some of the other traditional Republican conservative positions, at least rhetorically, that were in agreement with libertarianism, even if they only honored it through rhetoric. Now we're not even getting the rhetoric in some cases.
Right. Hey guys, let's take a minute to talk about one of our sponsors, and that is Lorenzotti Coffee. I love these guys, not just because they were our very first sponsor, but because, like I've said many times, their coffee is so damn good. If you guys like coffee that tastes the way coffee is actually supposed to taste, with natural flavors that come from the region and the roast of the beans, rather than from artificial flavorings like some other brands use, well, then you'll love Lorenzotti Coffee. If you're a real coffee drinker like myself, you don't want these weird flavors in your coffee like key lime pie or blueberry muffin. You want strong, traditional flavors that actually come from the beans themselves, and that's exactly what you get with Lorenzotti Coffee. You can get Lorenzotti's signature Venetian blend. The stuff comes right from Italy, okay? You can do whole beans, medium fine grind, which that one's actually perfect to use in the French press like I prefer. It comes in these really cool, beautifully designed, resealable tins that ship to you, hermetically sealed, and keep the coffee very, very fresh. Guys, I cannot speak highly enough of Lorenzotti. They're lovers of liberty. They love this show. They support this show. So why not support them by getting yourself some damn good coffee? So go to lorenzotti.coffee. That is LORENZOTTI.coffee. Guess what? We got a promo code, and that, as you know, is DTTP for Death to Tyrants Podcast. You'll get 10% off your order at checkout. Again, that's lorenzotti.coffee. Enter code DTTP at checkout. Let's get back to the show. One of the things you wrote me that really, when we started talking about having you on here, that I was kind of floored by, to be quite honest with you, and a bit jealous. You went to the John Randolph Club, I believe you said 1992, and you saw Murray Rothbard speak there, which obviously to myself and a lot of my listeners is pretty incredible. For my listeners who are not familiar with the John Randolph Club, can you explain what that was and why it represented such an important moment in history?
Everybody is with the term paleo-libertarianism, I assume.
I hope so.
Well, if not, they need to go back to your archives and look at your interviews with Lou Rothbard and Phil Bishop. Paleo-libertarianism was a kind of an effort led by Murray Rothbard and Lou Rockwell in the late 80s and early to mid 90s to kind of create a libertarianism that was welcoming to middle-class values, middle-class Christians who, at the time, there was a strong element in the Libertarian Party that was heavily influenced by Rand and also by the 60s counterculture that was hostile to Christianity in particular, but any kind of organized religion. and just any kind of what we would call, I think, bourgeois values. And it was also in alliance with paleo alt-right conservatives represented by, at the time, the Rockford Institute and Pat Buchanan. And there was, as Lou referenced on his podcast with you, an alliance between the two sides. And the meeting place for that alliance was the John Randolph Club, which was co-sponsored by the Mises Institute, an organization, the Center for Libertarian Studies, which was also a Rothbard founded and created think tank run by Blumert, who also was chairman of the Mises Institute after Margaret von Mises passed away, and was also an early founder and supporter of the Mises Institute, and was a great leader in the gold coin industry and a friend and business partner of Ron Paul and Ron Paul Coins, and supporter of Ron's, chairman of Ron's Libertarian Party bid, and active in the 2008 campaign to some extent, and just a wonderful, wonderful guy and a wonderful human being. And then the Rockford Institute, and the point of it was to have the discussions between paleo libertarians and paleo conservatives over, what we agreed on, what we disagreed on, and who the enemies were, which was the establishment Republicans and the neoconservatives. And I got to go to this meeting because I'd done some work, as I mentioned earlier, some research work for Lew Rockwell. I'd also worked with Lou and Bert and other paleo libertarians and just libertarians and paleo conservatives on the draft Ron Paul committee, which was an effort to get Ron to, or the Ron Paul Exploratory Committee, which was an effort to see if Ron could make any headway primarying the first George Bush in the 92 primary. That ended when Buchanan decided to get in, and Buchanan, one of the first calls he made was to Ron to seek Ron's endorsement. And Ron was eager to see Bush challenged on his wars and taxes, but at the time wasn't really eager to do it himself. So having just come off a presidential run 4 years earlier. And so Ron threw his support behind Buchanan. But anyway, because of that, Bert and Lou arranged for me to get a scholarship to attend the Rockford Club meeting, which is where I talked to Murray once or twice on the phone. I wrote him a letter and then talked to him on the phone. So I kind of knew him. That was where I got to meet him and got to hear him speak on a wonderful speech called A Strategy for the Right. And he laid out the case for libertarian populism, which is something that has stuck with me to this day. And it actually, I look at it as kind of guiding what Campaign for Liberty does, because, again, what we do is we try to mobilize people to pressure their elected officials to vote right. And we don't play this game of going into the elected officials and saying, like, we have all this money for you, or, what, and then saying, like, what is the most acceptable thing to you that fits our agenda, so we can tell our supporters that you're a good guy, which a lot of groups in DC do. They love to play the access game. We don't want to play the access game. We want to play the liberty game. And the liberty game requires you to take a more confrontational attitude, a more populist edge with politicians, and to recognize that when it comes to the struggle between liberty and freedom, the enemy is always the elites. Because it's the elites who run the system, it's the elites who benefit the system, it's the elites who produce the propaganda that gets the masses to go along with them. So if you want to win for liberty, you've got to mobilize the masses. Maybe not the masses. You've got to mobilize a crucial tipping point of people, what can be the tireless and irate minority that Dr. Paul talked about in 2012. But you've got to get average people on your side, and you've got to get them involved, active, and you've got to get them seeing the truth and not buying the status propaganda. And Murray's speech explained all that. He went through why it was important to kind of reject not just the liberal establishment, but also the conservative establishment. At the time, were still represented by William F. Buckley Jr. in National Review, why it was great is it was important to have unification between true libertarians and true constitutional conservatives. And it was just a wonderful speech. And like I said, it's Murray's thought has influenced me probably more than any other thinker. And his strategic thought has influenced me a great deal. And I'm glad to see that there's interest among you and Zoe Bishop and others in the libertarian world, because for a couple of years, I thought the only two libertarians who still were actually interested in looking and pursuing and trying to apply Murray's strategic visions and strategies and thoughts were myself and Justin Raimondo. And as sadly as you know, we lost Justin, who was also a friend of mine and a mentor last year. But it was a wonderful case. I mean, it was a wonderful case. I mean, the Paleo Alliance ultimately fell apart because, as was predicted by a friend of mine, who told me after the fact that he never thought it would last. And he said, because the problem was, he said, if paleo conservatives were really consistent friends of liberty that we could cooperate with across the board, they wouldn't be paleo conservatives, they'd be paleo libertarians.
Sure.
And I mean, that is a problem with cross ideological alliances at anything more than a single issue coalition. Maybe we can pick off some members and recruits and also make some good gains on some of our important issues. But eventually it's going to fall apart because if it's anything more than a single issue, because you don't know how they feel on that single issue. I mean, I remember there was at least one day in 2009 where I went to a morning meeting with a bunch of leftists to talk about civil liberties and surveillance. And then I went to a lunch sponsored by the Heritage Foundation to talk about opposing Obamacare. Now, to me, I was the only person at both of those meetings. And to me, I was being completely consistent. But to everybody else who was in either of those rooms, they would have been scratching their heads, wondering, like, well, how can you oppose government surveillance and also oppose Obamacare? But I'm sure to you and to your listeners, you're all thinking, well, how can you not oppose government surveillance and not oppose Obamacare? They're both infringements on liberty.
Right. Do you think mainstream libertarianism has a blind spot when it comes to culture?
I do. I agree with Andrew Breitbart that culture is important, and that culture, because culture is upstream from politics. I think that because the values that we have, they come from our culture, they come from our education, they come from our religious training and background, and they matter more to most people than political ideology. And so if your political ideology doesn't take into account people's cultural values, you're setting yourself back. I also think that I also agree with Breitbart that we need to be aware of the fact that because the left, who is, I don't like to say the left, I don't like to use those terms, but because the left part of the statist one-party system that pretends to be a two-party system controls Hollywood and the academia. That matters. It matters that they're pumping out these messages to our children and to the general public through their schools, colleges, universities, and then through their movies, TV shows, and streaming services, in support of war, in support of Obamacare, and portraying businessman and capitalism as evil and as the problem. That can affect how people vote, and that makes it much harder for us to get our message across and to win. Now, on the other hand, one of our great strengths as a philosophy and a movement is the fact that we do not spill over into culture. We do not tell people, you must live this way if you want to be a true libertarian. We tell people, you can choose how you live, but you can't tell other people, you can't use government force to tell people how to live. You can use your own tools of persuasion and your voice and your own property rights to try and persuade people to live, and you don't have to associate with people whose lifestyle choices you disagree with, but you just can't use the state to use it. And I think that in some ways it's a mistake to graft a particular cultural point of view and say you must be this way to be a libertarian. Interestingly, I was just thinking about this the other day. It seems like if you look at the libertarian blogosphere and social media world, it's mostly the left libertarians who are dogmatic about wanting their cultural views to be grafted onto libertarianism and want to say that if you are don't embrace left-wing cultural values, that you are a bad person, but you are not just a bad person, but you are a bad libertarian, and you should be purged from the movement. Whereas what would be called right libertarians tend to be much more ecumenical about saying, I believe that a free society has to be undergirded by certain cultural values, but that doesn't mean that everybody has to share those values, or that you're a bad libertarian if you don't share these cultural values.
Right. What pushback have you seen over the years from, we'll say, maybe even the Libertarian Party or what we could call Libertarianism Incorporated against the Ron Paul movement, and whether it be his followers or the man himself?
Well, I mean, at Campaign for Liberty, we focus on policy issues, and I don't get involved in a lot of these, inter-movement conflicts. As I get older, I find that I see the country deteriorating, I find myself having less and less time and patience for libertarian nitpicking and squabbling. But I see the same things as other people do, and it astounds me. And every so often, I get outraged. There were a few comments made recently about Dr. Paul. There was a comment made this week by someone who writes for one of our prominent, More Reason magazine, one of our prominent magazines. I happen to know that that's not a universally shared opinion at Reason. In fact, one of Reason's senior editors, Brian Doherty, wrote hopefully what is going to be the first of many books examining Ron and his movement and his impact, not just on the libertarian movement, but on American politics in general, and political and cultural life in general. And it astounds me that you would spend your time if you're a libertarian, that you would want to spend your time attacking Ron Paul. If you want to say, I disagree with him on an issue like immigration, or say, I'm a Milton Friedmanite, so I disagree with Congressman Paul on monetary policy. That's fine. I can, I'll gladly debate you on why it's not self-evidently wrong, why Ron is not straying from the libertarian plumb line in his views on these issues. But to engage in personal attacks to say that he's or to try and deny that he didn't benefit the libertarian movement because a few people who came into the libertarian movement because of Dr. Paul disregarded Dr. Paul's teachings and his speeches and took a turn towards something that might be ugly. That's not Dr. Paul's fault. That's in the opposite of what Dr. Paul did. As my friend Jack Hunter says about some people, there's people in the movement who haven't actually listened, or they forgot everything that Ron said in 2008 and 2012. And they've gotten involved in identity politics. They've gotten involved in cultural politics, and they've abandoned, and they've also gotten involved in personalities. But that's dismissing what Ron Paul's message was. That's not embracing it. So I don't see how you can blame Dr. Paul for that. And also just, knowing him for as long as I have, and knowing just what a good and decent person he is, it is very, very infuriating to see people launch vicious personal attacks on him who don't know the man, who don't know his character, who don't understand what he's all about. This is a guy who in 1970s Texas went into a hospital emergency room to start his shift, and there was a mixed race couple there who the woman was having difficulty in pregnancy, and he not only immediately made sure that the woman was properly taken care of when the hospital staff, according to the husband of the woman, and this is from an ad that the Ron Paul Super PAC ran in 2012. So you can look it up on. It's called The Compassion of Paul. You can look it up on YouTube still. Ron immediately charged and made sure the woman was properly cared for. Unfortunately, the child was stillborn, I believe, but the end of the story is that when the husband asked about the bill, because he was going to have trouble paying the bill, the hospital said, "Don't worry about it. Dr. Paul took care of it," and he did this without questioning, regardless of race or status. He did this for I don't know how many people when he was a practicing medical doctor, and also, I will tell you what's kind of frustrating from a political standpoint. He would get up in debates in 2008 and 2012, and he would say, "Well, when I was a doctor, I never accepted Medicaid," and the left would roll on him, and it was because he never said, because it's his character to not say the final point, which is, I simply treated people, and if they couldn't pay, they couldn't pay.
Right.
If I had to help them pay their medical bills to other to hospitals, I helped them do that because I thought it was part of my responsibility as a physician. Right. And these pygmies are going to attack a character of a man like that, and they're going to call him a racist. Are you kidding me? What kind of world do we live in?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. I think it's time for Bruce Banner to reemerge.
There you go. That was a good rant. Those tweets got me fired up last week as well. It was it was disappointing from a name from a magazine like that. I'll say that.
Right, and especially a magazine that should know better, and also from someone who, because they write a lot about criminal justice reform and those types of issues, should understand that it was the Ron Paul movement that brought the idea of opposing the drug war and talking about the racial disparities of the drug war and how it spills over into police militarization into the Republican bloodstream. And that was picked up by his son, Senator Paul, again, who's done heroic work on that. And, it's one thing to have the idiots from Antifa and the official idiots from the official Black Lives Matter group attack Rand Paul because he's literally attack Rand Paul.
Yes.
To bring it back to Campaign for Liberty, and we're ecumenical. You don't have to agree with me or anybody else on left libertarianism, right libertarianism. You just have to agree with us on big liberty issues. Ending the surveillance state, ending the welfare state, ending the warfare state, and auditing the Fed is the first step towards getting back to a real constitutional monetary system with free market money and competing currencies, plus all the other big issues. And we can argue about whether left or right libertarianism is the correct organizing principle after we, at the very least, restore the original Constitution. But that's a pretty big bite. And I think one of the problems I have with all these with all these squabbles and people taking pot shots at Ron and left versus right libertarianism, I think they do distract from the challenge that we're facing. And right now, given our dire situation, given the fact that mothers are being thrown into jail because they won't put on a mask while watching their son's Little League game. Yeah. The dollar and the Fed is just pumping money into the economy, and politicians who 6 years ago were supporting audit the Fed are now cheering on the Fed because they say it's the only thing keeping the economy at all functioning. I think that we just don't need these fights. We need to keep our eye on the big picture.
Yes,
and that's why I like people who are doing that. I would encourage people who want to fight the big issues and who understand that the enemy is the Romans, not the United People's Front of Judea. They're throwing a Monty Python reference to spruce up my nerd credentials to check out Campaign for Liberty.
Yeah, exactly. Well put, Norman. To go back to that conversation, not that conversation, but the speech that you saw Murray Rothbard give, not only for my listeners, but for myself, because like I said, I'm a little jealous that you got to see this epic. This is one of his best talks, and you saw it live in person. Using kind of the points that he made within that speech and just his writings on the topic since then, how do you think some of those points could be implemented into the political environment that we currently find ourselves in? It seems to a lot of younger people like no one's ever seen anything like this before. I'd be curious to see what Murray Rothbard would say about this current moment. But do you see any within his strategy for the right or his coalition building that he'd like to discuss? Can you relate any of that to where we are now?
Well, I think we have an anti-war current on the right that was brought to the fore by Pat Buchanan in the 90s, and people forget this, but there was a significant pushback among Republicans to Clinton's Bosnia intervention, and it kind of goes back to the flip side of what we were talking about before, which is the left liking humanitarian interventionism, and there was a sense that among Republicans that Clinton is, he's waging wars for the United Nations. That he's doing this. Troops as social workers was actually a phrase uttered by mainstream Republicans in the 90s. And at one point in the 90s, Bill Kristol actually threatened to leave the Republican Party after the Republicans, some mainstream Republicans, including Kay Bailey Hutchison, expressed opposition to some of the Clintons bombing in Bosnia. But there's an opportunity there for us to make inroads and work with the anti-war rightists. We have still skepticism of the Fed, which Trump campaigned on. Unfortunately, he hasn't governed that way. And when he criticizes the Fed now, instead of talking about auditing the Fed and how low interest rates are killing the middle class, he says we need zero interest rates. But that's an issue we need to keep hammering on. And there's going to be great potential for us to build a populist coalition around that issue. And I think that the core Rothbardian insight on strategy is that populism, again, is the way that libertarianism can come into the real world, because, again, it's the elites who benefit from the state, who benefit from the welfare, even the welfare state, and certainly from the warfare state. And it is the people who suffer from that. And so it is a job of education, but then after education, we need mobilization. Because if people get educated and they know the truth, but then they just go home and go about their lives and society continues to fall apart, we're not really accomplishing anything. That's why people need to get active and get involved in spreading the message, yes, and also doing something to change it. And it's not enough to vote and then go home. The most important, I believe that, and I think Murray would agree with this, is that the most important day for an activist who's serious about accomplishing liberty and not just electing Team Red or Team Blue is the day after the election. Because the day after the election is when you look at who won, who lost, why did they lose, what happened, what circumstance, well, how does the election leave us in our legislature, which is the body that is by design closest to the people. And also at the federal level, Congress is Article 1 for a reason. And what are the major threats to liberty? And you start planning to do that. The political class wants you to vote, and they want you to go home, and they don't want you to just go to sleep, and they want you to forget about politics for the next 2 or 4 or 6 years. They don't want you involved. They don't want you calling their offices. They don't want you writing letters. They don't want you signing petitions. And again, and to get back to your question, I think that Rothbard has a lot to teach us strategically, and that's one of the things. Is I remember he in that speech he talking about Pat Buchanan. He said that it's not just Buchanan's message that the elites despise. It's the way he delivers it. It's that hard-edged content. It's the way it appeals to. It's the way it appeals to people beyond the Georgetown Supper Club set. It's the way Pat's delivery and his phraseology was aimed at attracting average Americans, to coin a phrase, not just people in the upper crust. They don't like a Ron Paul, again, also because of that same thing, because Ron appealed to people outside of the political mainstream. And they certainly don't want that message of being pro-liberty across the board. I think the other thing I took from that speech, too, was, remember at the time, the Soviet Union was falling apart. In fact, I think they just dissolved it. It was December of 91. This was January of 92, so it would have just dissolved. Is that the sense of optimism that empires fall, governments fall, and sometimes they fall in the blink of an eye when nobody expected it. If someone had told me in 1986, when I came back from a month-long student trip to the Soviet Union, that within 5 years, the Berlin Wall, not only would the Berlin Wall have fallen, but the entire Soviet Union would have dissolved, I would have said, you're crazy. Mm-hmm. And also, I think that one of the important things that we need to remember from Murray is we do need to, all of us need to, and this is also something you learned from Ron Paul, is that we can't just say, well, I've read Human Action and Man, Economy, and State, and For New Liberty and Democracy, the God That Failed. Therefore, I now know everything, and I can stop learning and go out and change the world. Some of the best advice Justin Raimondo gave me when I was in my 20s was, he said, don't do a lot of running around. Don't think that you have to solve everything right now. He said, spend some time reading and thinking and learning, and then you'll be able to make an effective difference because you'll have knowledge. I think I know some activists who kind of look down their nose at think tank people, bloggers, or people who just read all day. But to me, if you want to be an effective activist and go out there and sell policies that go against what most people had beat into them through 12 years of government schooling, you need to be able to defend those policies. And that means you need to have read something, and you need to be up to date on current events and the context in which your ideas are going to be asked to apply themselves to people's lives. I mean, so everybody, and especially those who are involved in, quote, practical, unquote, politics, need to read and think and study and learn so that they can go out and effectively make change. That's why I think podcasts like yours are important. And I think websites like Mises.org, LouRockwell.com, the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, antiwar.com, and others are just so important because they can they make it easy for our activists to know what they need to know to challenge the propaganda of the states and hopefully grow the movement, and through growing the movement, make the politicians vote for liberty, and by doing so, help restore the Constitution and maybe even avoid the forthcoming economic crash, which could be the one that pushes the system over into the brink.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could see, as Dr. Paul has talked about a lot, you could see a major dollar crisis coming. I mean, we see China is moving against the dollar's world currency status, and I would expect, as no matter who the next president is, as the next Cold War with China heats up, you're going to see more of that.
Mm-hmm.
And as our spending gets out of control and our Fed gets out of control, the two are going to feed into each other. And again, that's why I think it's so important that we keep our eyes on these big issues and not get distracted by personal fights or by squabbles over things that don't really have anything to do with the major challenges facing liberty in this country.
Yep, no doubt. This episode will actually be released Monday, the day before the election, and you just kind of hinted at it a while ago. Do you have any predictions? I mean, obviously 2020 is insane, so there's no telling what's going to happen. Any predictions on what happens then tomorrow as this episode comes out?
I predict that it's going to be closer than anybody thinks. I think that there's a good chance that Trump could once again defy the predictions of all the experts and win. He seems to have the enthusiasm. His rallies are big, and his people are his people. They want to vote for Trump. Do you know anyone who's enthusiastic about Joe Biden?
No. In fact, it reminds me a lot of John Kerry's run. I believe it was in 2004, I guess, against Bush. But I remember back then I was young, kind of getting into politics. I was a libertarian. And I remember seeing anyone but Bush. And I thought, what an odd saying for John Kerry's candidacy. Like, it's kind of making him out to be no one important. And I feel like that's how the Biden candidacy is at this moment.
Well, there's almost a sense that, like, and you even hear like Democrats openly talk about how, like, we just need Joe Biden to help us get rid of Trump, and then as soon as he's sworn in, we'll gracefully ease him out of the White House, and then Kamala Harris can take over. And even Biden himself said, "I'm a transitional figure."
Yes.
So it's, what does Joe Biden? And plus, he's someone who has run unsuccessfully twice before for president. So I think it's going to be closer than anybody thinks it will. I think that Jo Jorgensen is going to acquit herself well on Tuesday, and at the end will also be able to say that, well, I know some of the messaging that's come out of the campaign, on Twitter has been slightly off where I think most of us would say a libertarian candidate should be. I think for the most part, she's done very well in presenting the message and in trying to reach out to non-traditional libertarian sympathizers and supporters. And I think that she's going to show that the Libertarian Party does not need to compromise its core values and beliefs to attract a former liberal Republican governor. And I'm not talking about a governor of New Mexico.
Right.
I'm talking about a governor of Massachusetts, just so we're clear, who says things like Hillary Clinton, the most unlibertarian public figure perhaps of my lifetime, and my lifetime does include the Johnson presidency, even though I don't remember that, in order to acquit itself well.
Yeah.
The House and the Senate, I'm not optimistic that the Republicans will keep the Senate. And to me, I do believe that if we still had a constitutional republic, those would be the races that really mattered. And again, as I said before, the legislature is Article 1 for a reason.
Right.
Campaign for Liberty focuses on the legislature because your representatives and senators are the ones who actually write the laws. Unfortunately, presidents have too much power over even the lawmaking process today, and then by executive order they can bypass the Congress. And neocons and big government conservatives have joined with big government progressives and establishment Democrats and establishment Republicans in creating this cult of what my friend Gene Haley from the Cato Institute calls the cult presidency for years. And one of the great things about Trump's election is that all of a sudden, what a lot of libertarians and others have warned them about, which was, what if somebody that you despise, that you don't trust, gets a hold of this tremendous executive power, executive state that you've created, and it happened, and to see the bedwetting over them, and to see Bill Kristol take his ball and go home and leave the Republican Party is wonderful. I think that the first job of libertarian Republicans, if Trump does lose, is to make sure that Bill Kristol knows that he's not welcome back.
Right.
Him and his little neocon buddies, the Democrats can have them.
Yes.
The neocons, starting with Bill's father Irving, began their lives as Trotskyites. They became centrist Democrats. I don't think they're going to go back to being Trotskyites, but I do hope they stay as centrist Scoop Jackson or Joe Lieberman Democrats, and don't try and weasel their way back into the conservative movement.
Yes, that is an excellent point to end on, because that's a point I've been making for a long time now. They are back, at least in the direction where they started, and I hope they stay. Norman Singleton, before we get out of here, you can go ahead and plug anything you have online, if you're on Twitter, where they can find Campaign for Liberty and any of that kind of stuff. CampaignForLiberty.com is our website. We have a Facebook page. You can like us on Facebook. Our site will keep you updated on the major happenings in Congress. We also have state organizations. If you go to our site, you can click on your state, see if there's a Campaign for Liberty state organization. Our state groups have done wonderful work in stopping Obamacare expansion, gun control, tax increases, property rights violations, police militarization, and a particular issue that I don't think any other group has done nearly the work that Campaign for Liberty state groups have on, is the anti-due process revenue-raising corporate welfare scheme known as red light cameras, or as we call them, red light scammers. Yes. Excellent. I will link to all of that, of course, in the show notes page for this episode. Norman Singleton, thank you so much for joining us here on Death to Tyrants.
Thank you.
All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that good chat with Norman Singleton. What an interesting guy, and what cool experiences he has had. Let me tell you real quick, the symposium with Ron Paul and special guests is this weekend. If you're listening to this podcast the week it comes out, that's November 7th. 2020 in Lake Jackson, Texas. I will be there. If you guys are there, let's have a drink. Well, they don't have alcohol there, I don't think, but let's at least say hi and come up to me and we'll chat. It will be good to meet some of you guys in person finally. Also, if anyone out there has at least 1 or 2 tickets available, like if you bought some and aren't able to go, hit me up and let me know. I've got some friends that are trying to get into this event. It's sold out, which is a good thing, but it's not a good thing if you're 2 of my friends that didn't get your tickets on time. So if you're there, let's hang out. Let's talk. We have a lake house for the weekend. So there we can have a drink, and I think we should. Hope to see some of you guys there. As for this show, of course, you already know, death2tyrantspodcast.com is where you can find everything you need to know about this show and get in contact with me. Until next week, what the hell's going on? Is the election still happening? Do we not know the results? We shall see. It's going to be good. Talk to you soon.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Death to Tyrants podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.